All right, we're live. Welcome to another Vervoe webinar. This is episode 7 out of 8, I think, in our series on the skills shortage. And today we are going to focus on hiring people from underrepresented groups, which Jared is going to tell us shortly. We should actually use a different term to talk about that. And we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, where are we in the world? So here in Paradise, it's 10 a.m. On the East Coast in New York and the rest of the East Coast, it's 8 p.m. In Dallas, where Jared is based, it's 7, 5 on the West Coast. And if you're living in Australia, where I am, you didn't imagine it. There was an earthquake about 30 minutes ago. Hopefully everyone's okay. It was pretty minor, but seems to be causing quite a bit of discussion because we don't normally get earthquakes. So welcome to everyone joining. Let me introduce Jared. Very lucky to have him join us today. So Jared Fitzpatrick, Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the Dallas Regional Chamber. And what Jared does is he's responsible for helping the member companies be more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive at board, C-suite and workforce levels. And he co-chairs a number of sub-councils that deal with everything from leadership to community investment in underserved areas, and all the way through to policing and criminal justice. So it's a pretty big job. Jared, thanks. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much.
So let's get straight into it. You know, the term, the heading that we've used is underrepresented groups. I know you've got an opinion on that. What does that mean, first of all? Are there certain people who are represented and other people who are not represented? And who are these represented people? And who are these people that are not represented, and why? What's going on?
Yeah. So first of all, again, just thank you so much for having me here. I am, in addition to my work at the DRC, just a huge advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've had life experiences that have kind of made me feel a little uncomfortable with the term underrepresented. I also don't love the term minority. I hear a lot of people use that term. The reason I don't like the term underrepresented is because it brings about a connotation that people have not gotten into these roles or into the positions because they simply didn't want to have that opportunity, right? And most of the time, it's not because they didn't choose that opportunity. It was that they were overlooked or that there was bias in the process. And so they weren't even considered for that opportunity. And so I use the term underestimated, and which is just a slight variation, right, on that underrepresented term. But it really highlights that there's not often a pipeline issue. It's that you're not looking in the right places. And so I know we'll talk a little bit about the pipeline later on. To get to your question about what does underrepresented cover, I think there's some in the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has definitions of what it means. And so you're talking about things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, veteran status. But I would actually expand that to things that you can't always see. And so I think that also encompasses mental status, life experience, socioeconomic status. So it's a pretty broad term when we talk about underrepresented. But typically people kind of hone in on those first few that I mentioned.
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack there. So we'll come back to the pipeline. I like underestimated. I like overlooked.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, before I ask you who's doing the estimation, I want to ask you first, that's a broad spectrum of parts of the community that you described. And there's a range of demographics, attributes, some physical, some not, seen, visible or not visible. And definitely that doesn't sound to me like a minority. That sounds like maybe a silent majority, right?
Right.
And so kind of, is there a way to, is there a tight definition? Kind of where does it end, or is this kind of who's the minority, who's the majority, who's doing the estimating, and who are the parts of the community that are being overlooked? Is it anyone who's basically not a white man? Like, let's kind of be blunt.
Yeah, I mean, so I think historically it has traditionally been anyone who's not a white man, a white male. I think now the definition is starting to shift a little bit, because in some organizations and in some areas, white men are not the majority anymore. Even in Dallas, you know, the census data was just recently released, and our Hispanic population has grown to the point where there is now they call minority majority. And so I can't say that in every single organization that we're talking about white men versus all others, but I think historically that's who we've been talking about.
Okay. So anyone who's not a white man, obviously that's an oversimplification, but
right.
The people who have found it more, is it fair to say people who found it more difficult to get access to employment opportunities because they've been, and I want you to explain what does underestimated mean? What's this estimation that's happening, and by who?
Well, you know, I really think what we're talking about is anyone who is not in the normalized group or the dominant group, the group that has power, right? So what we're saying when we say underestimated is that those people are traditionally in the margin. They may have been forgotten about, or I like the term overlooked, especially in the hiring process, because I think about someone literally looking at a resume, and because of the name on the resume or education qualification that they may not have, they're literally putting them to the side and looking over them to somebody else that may fit the more traditional mold that they hire from.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what I'm really getting at.
So I like that as well, and we use that term a lot, more broadly than just to talk about diversity. We talk about people that are overlooked in the hiring process for all sorts of reasons. They don't look similar enough to the hiring manager.
Right.
They didn't go to the same school. It's not necessarily that they're from a marginalized background, but they're being overlooked for all sorts of reasons. Excuse me. So, okay. So let's kind of move along to, so I think we've got an understanding of kind of this dynamic, but why should companies care? Why is this an important problem to solve? Okay. Other than, it's obvious why for the people who are overlooked. That's obvious. But why should companies care? There are a lot of people, and I've spoken to a lot of them, who they won't publicly admit this. They will publicly pretend that this is important because it's the politically correct thing to say, and they don't want to be sort of, criticized. But it's not that they're against it, but they don't fully understand why this is a major talking point and why this is such an important thing. And so what's your answer to that question? Like, why is this an important issue? Why should we care?
So I think the biggest reason why is that it's a business imperative. So take aside the fact that it's the right thing to do. Take aside the fact that it's fair. Right? Companies that are more diverse, more inclusive, and more equitable have higher innovation because there's better ideas being brought to the table. There's more perspectives that are being added into the conversation. They have better profits. Again, kind of tying back to that innovation piece, but also thinking about the fact that you're able to access a customer segment that you traditionally might not have been able to get to because you have people in that organization who can help you understand that customer or that market. Recruitment is better when people can see themselves in the organization. Like if I see someone who looks like me or my age group or my generation or who has a similar background to me represented across the table in an interview, I'm more likely to feel like I would belong in that organization. So your recruiting prospects are better and your retention is better. Right? It's a huge cost.
So I think intuitively most people understand the representation angle around let's say I'm a woman and I'm an engineer and I want to join a company and the 12 existing engineers are all men. Well, that might raise some questions, not necessarily for everyone, but some people might say, well, when we turn from 12 to 24, is it still going to be all men? Am I going to be the only woman on the team? And I also get the customer angle of like, you know, understanding the customers. But so let me just ask you on that. What if I'm selling a product to women, let's say bras, and I actually met a company that makes bras, and we had this discussion. I'm interested in your opinion on this. We're only selling this product to women. Should our employees be all women, or because they would presumably understand that product, or is it important to have a diverse mix of people and mix of thinking beyond just looking like the customer?
I think the latter. Right. So any environment that is homogeneous, where you have everybody who is the same, I think you're setting yourself up for failure. And it might be in the short term, it works, because clearly we saw companies who were very homogeneous historically who made profit. But because the world is becoming more diverse, your customer segment, even though it might all be women, does not mean that that's a monolith, right? Having a customer segment that's all women doesn't mean that your company is going to be able to understand all aspects of that market. The other piece of this that I don't think we've talked about as much is if you don't have people in your organization who can help you think about the next trend, right? The next big thing that's on the horizon, then eventually you're going to stagnate. And, you know, stagnation leads to failure for companies. So it's not necessarily about who are we matching our market to from our employee base now. It's about where are we going to be in 5, 10 years, 20 years, and who can help us get there. So your example was pretty specific about the broad company, but even there, you need men who are in that organization, or people who, you know, are maybe women, but maybe coming from different cultural backgrounds than your largest market segment, to think about where should we be going from here. So
you're saying that we want to create differences of experience, differences of opinion. People have had different life journeys, because that creates tension that leads to innovation. So some of the excuses that we hear when people are trying to sort of sidestep the diversity narrative, one which you touched on is the pipeline. You know, oh, there aren't really, you know, we're a mining and oil and gas company. Women don't want to work in mining and oil and gas, or there are no tech candidates that are from this background, or whatever the excuse is. And the second excuse, which you kind of implicitly touched on, is, and this is one of many, there are more than two, is, oh, but they won't fit the culture. It's going to create friction. It's going to create tension. So, okay, so let's get straight into. We don't want to talk about the easy stuff here. We want to talk about the hard stuff. So, pipeline, is that a valid excuse? I mean, last time I checked, the planet was equally divided between men and women, about 50-50, not exactly. And there's certainly non-binary and other, I'm not trying to exclude, but at a high level, we're talking about certainly there's not like 2/3 of the planet is men. So if we just look at gender alone, and then you look at the CEOs, I think there's more CEOs of Fortune 500 companies whose name is John than CEOs who are women, something like that. So let's talk about pipeline, and then let's talk about the kind of to be diverse. Does it necessarily mean that it comes with discomfort? And if so, is that a good or bad thing?
Well, so to address the initial question about pipeline, I absolutely think that is a myth, simply because I'm seeing the numbers of graduates. So there's more Black, Hispanic women going into computer science and engineering degrees than there are jobs available for them, right? So it's not a pipeline issue. The issue really is, are the companies looking outside their traditional channels? So are they going to the Hispanic serving institutions or the historically Black colleges and universities? Are they building true partnerships, not we're going to come to your one career fair and hope, right? Or they're doing the post and pray, where they posted on a job board for Prospanica or any organization that focuses on a specific demographic, and just hoping that the people come to them. So I really, as employers to look at their recruitment process. Look at the people who are on your panel or on your recruiting team. And just consider the fact that for most people, we have friends, or our network is comprised of people who look like, act like, think like us. And so if your recruiting team or your hiring team is primarily composed of the same type of people, they're going to favor people who, again, have their same attributes. And then there was a well-known study that people who have more white-sounding names get more callbacks on resumes. Right? And so I often will advocate for people to do skills-based hiring or blind hiring, just to take some of that initial bias out of the process. And frankly, I'll say the competition right now, because after George Floyd this past year, so many companies made commitments and statements. There is a huge pull for Black talent in specifics, but just talent from underestimated groups in general. So the companies that are winning are the ones that can demonstrate their value by really showcasing what they're doing internally. And frankly, they got to pay. You know, you have to put your money where your mouth is. And you have to offer sometimes things that you've never done before. I'm seeing that more and more, where companies are, you know, although many of them have been working remotely, they're now offering, hey, you can work remotely permanently, or other flexible work arrangements, just to get people in the door who are interested in interviewing.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, before we get to that, the second point, I just want to reflect on what you said, so that for everyone who's listening. So the pipeline thing is an excuse, and really companies only have themselves to blame if they're not successful in this area. And I don't say that in a critical sense. I think it really means that they need to get their recruitment process right. They need to attract, they need to look in the right areas. They need to attract people in the right way. And it's not about the candidates don't exist. That's the point I want to get across.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, and so stop me if we are. But I think there's also a lot that can be done in how you go to market. So there are job descriptions, what you're saying when you're reaching out to candidates.
Let's get into that. So let's get into that, and we don't necessarily need to roll out the whole sort of toolkit.
We don't have to go through all the 20 things.
But what's an example? Can you give like one example of a company that you think is doing something really interesting, doing this really well, and they're not a Facebook or like a sort of logo that everyone's necessarily heard of, where they can basically snap their fingers and candidates pour in? Who's doing this well? What can we learn from that?
Well, so to that point, I think there are a lot of companies that are doing this well. Diversity Inc., Diversity Best Practices, even Fortune, they released a list this year of like the 20 top companies, and most of those companies look the same. And it is the big tech companies, it's the banks. But one company that I looked at a lot lately is Hilton, which is the big hotel brand, hotel and restaurants, right? And so they, like many companies, have implemented a policy of a diverse slate. And so essentially 50% of their candidates for all of their externally posted roles have to be from one of the categories of diversity that they're looking for to bring into their organization. I would encourage more companies not just to put the policy in place, but to actually enforce the policy, which it sounds so simple, right? But what I've seen is that, Hilton, for example, again, has actually put it in place where if their managers are not doing this, that they can actually be dinged in their performance review, which is like...
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to pause on that, because I want to, I think there are a lot of people asking about how we influence managers, but before we get to that, I just want to ask on the quota, on the 50%. It sounds like you're supportive of that. One of the arguments that you hear in opposition to that is, that's reverse discrimination. Now we're discriminating against white guys. I've heard it. You've heard it. I've got a view on it. What's your view? What do you say to people who say that?
So I've primarily heard that from white men, so
what a shock.
Yeah, before I go into the vilifying white men, which is not my intention at all, I will say that most white guys that I've talked to will actually support the idea of more diversity, but behind closed doors, often what they feel like is they're being attacked, right? Or they feel like, to your point, reverse discrimination is happening, and we're going back to the affirmative action days, where opportunities are going to a diversity hire, not necessarily the most qualified person.
Right.
What I would say to that is, there's a well-known book out called White Fragility, which it's funny because I hear a lot of white men and women say that they find it offensive being called fragile, which kind of proves the point of the book. But underlying that, I think that it's really about identities. And when people understand that certain identities have been kept out of the conversation, or out of positions of power, and I really center the conversation around fairness and just helping them to understand through story, which I find is one of the most helpful ways to drive a point home with someone in a one-on-one conversation, is just explaining the lived experience of someone from an identity that has traditionally not been in power,
right?
No matter what that is, right? And providing a safe space for those white men to explore these topics, because for some of them, it's the first time that they've really thought about their own identity and privilege. And I know privilege can sometimes be a trigger word for people, but that's really what this is. And so just understanding that we all have identities that provide unique insight, including them, right? So it's not about reverse discrimination. It again goes back to, do we want to have the best ideas and the best perspectives around the table?
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. So let's come back to Hilton. So you then,
yeah.
I didn't want to get off track, but I did want to.
No.
Because I know this is going through people's minds. As soon as they hear 50%, people think, oh, hang on, am I so I wanted to raise that. So now you got to like the managers. You said it's a great policy in theory, but some of the managers may or may not be enforcing it, and it's linked to their performance. So tell us about that, because one of the questions from the audience, and actually a lot of people have asked this, is how do I take people along for the journey? I think a lot of talent professionals are on board and trying to do this, but there's resistance internally inside companies from people whose job it is, their full-time job is not recruitment or diversity, or they're managing a team of whatever, engineers, manufacturing people, customer service. They're doing their role, and now they're being told to change the way they think about how we bring talent into the company and how we work. And they've got smoke coming out of their ears, and so I think a lot of talent professionals are thinking, like, how do we bring these people along for the journey, and and to your point, how do we put this into practice so it's not just talk on the website, platitudes on the website of we care about diversity? How do we actually do it? So tell us about that.
So, I think the first step is before you roll out the policy that people are going to be measured on, is actually just baseline training. HP, Expedia, some big names, some of our members, Hilti, Wells Fargo, have all rolled out mandatory training for hiring managers. And I would even encourage that recruiting staff should be required to go through this training about what diversity and inclusion are and common sources of bias in the hiring process. So that's the first step, is that they're all speaking the same language, because nothing is worse than somebody like me, a D&I professional or a recruiting professional, going to a hiring manager and starting just spitting out or spouting these terms that they have no idea what you're talking about. But because we live in this world, it just comes second nature. So I would say start there. And then I truly feel and believe and have seen the results of measuring the progress, right? So just like hiring managers are measured on other priorities, hitting their budget, making department performance goals, it should be, if diversity is an area, is a priority that companies truly care about, there should be measurement and expectations for hiring managers around their performance. And so it's not a compliance exercise. But if you set a goal to have gender parity or a gender balanced workforce, That's not saying that all hiring managers should only interview women, because that's tokenism, and back to that affirmative action thinking. But setting the diverse slate protocol in place simply says we're going to do, as recruiting staff, hiring managers, a better job of reaching out to candidates and finding them in places that we traditionally would not have looked, so that we have a larger pool to choose from when we're doing our interviews. And then there's another company, VMware. They have a policy that no hiring process will end unless a candidate from an underrepresented or underestimated background is interviewed, which is a little, it might be a little bit concerning to people. But I often will ask, well, why is that concerning? If you're doing your job as recruiters, and some companies even have dedicated recruiters that are just focused on engaging with diverse populations, then that should be happening anyway, right? And so I think it's just transitioning from this mindset of tokenism and we're doing this just so we can check a box, to this should be embedded into our hiring process anyway.
Do you think we're making progress? You've been working in this field.
I really do.
Are we getting better?
I do. I'm encouraged. There's new programs that are out. 110 is one that I'm watching really closely. It's a national coalition to hire on 1 million Black workers over the next 10 years. Got started last year. Over 50 companies have signed on. I'm encouraged to see, things like CEO Action, where over 2,000 CEOs have signed on to say we're going to create an inclusive work environment, and they're sharing the knowledge and frankly the failures too of their organizations with each other. So I do think that we're moving forward. I'm very encouraged that this upcoming generation, Gen Z, that's coming into the workforce now, they are requiring, right? It's no longer them asking for more diversity. They're requiring that a company at least has a diversity statement, that they have employee resource groups in place. So all of these things make me excited. Even better, last month, the SEC finalized a ruling that any company listed on the NASDAQ had to have reported on their board diversity, have at least 2 directors from a diverse group, right? So this isn't even just because of the worker expectations. It's now just an expectation across the board, not just from the EEOC, but from the exchanges, right? So I'm excited because I see this now as becoming the norm as opposed to the exception.
And to the people that are going to roll their eyes and say, oh, that's tokenism, that's quota, what do we say to them?
I go back to skills-based hiring here. Look at your competencies, look at what skills are required for the role, and then judge people based on what they can do, right? As opposed to what they look like. I get it, right? We all have biases. I have them too. These are difficult topics to address, but let's think about the best person to fill that role. And hopefully they bring more perspectives to the organization than what you currently have, right? But at its core, this is not about tokenism. It's not about affirmative action. It's truly about finding the right person for that job, but then base it on that, based on the skills, not on those little biases that creep into your hiring process based on their name or what school they went to. So leave all that stuff in 2020 or 2021, right? Let's let that go.
So it's not that there are people from different groups that are better or worse at doing jobs. It's that our brain plays tricks on us and convinces us that to overlook people from certain groups, because we have this idea in our head that if you look and sound like X, then you fit better. And if we cast that aside, it'll take care of itself by focusing on competency. Is that fair? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's the goal. Ultimately, I pray for the day when roles like mine are no longer needed, because these things.
And let's finish on that point as we wrap, because you're saying let skills-based hiring focus on the competency, but you're also saying and I don't think this is necessarily at odds, but it's an important distinction, that you're supportive of what the SEC is doing, you're supportive of what Hilton's doing. So two directors from identities that have been historically overlooked, to 50% of the candidate pool. And these don't necessarily have to be the specific measures, but they're good examples. So my interpretation of that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're saying, well, this thing isn't going to get started on its own. We've got to take some really strong action to get the ball rolling, and eventually we'll get out of our own way, and we won't need to talk about diversity all day long because it won't be a thing. Is that have I got that right or wrong?
You got it. You hit the nail on the head. The more we can automate some of these processes and take our own biases and outdated perspectives out of the equation, the easier that this will get, and the less we'll be talking about it, and the more it'll just happen. Right? But again, I hope for the day when I don't have to do that. But I also recognize that we've been fighting these same fights and having these same conversations and webinars for 30, 40 years.
Right.
And so what I hope is that in the next generation, we will stop having so many conversations, and the action will be happening within the organizations, as opposed to just, on the screen or in the conference room. Right. But I am hopeful. Like I said, I am very hopeful because I'm seeing more action than I ever have, more momentum than ever right now.
That's very encouraging. And so let's, on that note, let's end on a positive note. Let's wrap and just summarize really quickly what we talked about, the highlights of today. So we talked about the terminology. What do things mean? Underestimated, overlooked is good language. We talked about taking decisive action and not just platitudes, but making sure that that's actually followed through and measured and rewarded inside the company. So we don't just say 50%, but then ignore it. We talked about education, so people understand, why is this important? What does it mean? What's the language we're using? Why should we care? But we also talked about the fact that this isn't about tokenism. This isn't about numbers. The numbers are important to drive change, to drive action. But at the end of the day, the goals are the same, which is to end up with the best people who can do their best work and feel like they belong. Have I missed anything?
The only thing I would add is, no matter what role you are, people listening, if you're the CEO or you're the on-the-job trainee who just got started, you have an opportunity and frankly a responsibility, because now you have the knowledge to say something or do something to change the status quo. One of my favorite quotes is, if you're not reinforcing the change, then you're reinforcing staying the same. So you can't be a bystander on this. You really have to use your voice and your power to move the needle in the right direction.
What a great point. Thanks for adding that, Jared. Thanks so much for dedicating not just your time, but sharing your wisdom and opinions on this topic. This isn't an easy topic, and I wanted to make sure that we don't shirk and the hard, that we have a ferocious discussion and not just talk about the easy stuff that you see in blog posts. And so thanks for getting stuck into these questions with us. Thanks for everyone who's listened in. Thanks for joining another Vervoe webinar. And next week, we'll be talking to Ellie from Who Gives a Crap, a company that makes recyclable toilet paper, environmentally friendly toilet paper. And there's probably a more elegant way to describe that, which we'll hear about next week. And we'll be talking about retaining high performance. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks.